Thanks for coming, everyone. This program has had some problems right from the beginning. We had to change the date by a week. Had a few people show up last week, but then the basketball Sweet 16 is going full bore tonight. We have to compete with that. We spelled two of the ladies' names wrong in the program, and you know, we're getting through it. We had to find. We had an overwhelming request after our men's program last year to see what the ladies did in or around World War II. And I found it was a little more difficult than I thought to identify 5 or 6 ladies that were in the war, because in those days there weren't many in it. And besides that, it was pretty hard to get ladies to admit that they were of the right age to have been in World War II. We had no trouble with the men. We had about 50 men that wanted to speak, and we couldn't get them out of here till midnight because they were all telling war stories. But tonight we've got these 5 ladies here. We had a 6th one, Betty Blackstone, whose husband was with the Chennault's Flying Tigers in China, and we would have really liked to have had her here, but she wound up in the hospital today, so we have 5 out of our 6. So, with that in mind, what we're going to do is have each one of these ladies speak for 10 or 12 minutes from their position right here on the stage, tell what they did. I'll give a little bio, a very brief bio on each one before they take the mic. They'll speak, and then we'll hand it to the next one, and when we're all through, we may have time for some questions. So, with that in mind, we're going to start off with Nancy Wilder. A lot of you know Nancy. Nancy's about as local as you can get. She grew up here in San Marino, went to Stoneman School in Huntington, South Pass San Marino High School, class of 41. Her brother was in my class a couple of years later, Johnny Alpine. And so she is really a native of San Marino, although she lives now in Pasadena. Nancy graduated from high school and went to Beloit College in Wisconsin. Spent 2 years at Beloit. By that time, the war was going on full strength. She couldn't resist joining up, so she joined the Waves, and she's going to tell us what she did in the Waves. And I've told all these gals that they can be as liberal as they like on their war tales. If they sunk a German U-boat single-handedly, I won't argue that. But anyway, Nancy, we'd like to hear from you now.
Paul, you took half of my speech away. I was going to tell him about living in San Marino, which is really about as exciting as the Waves. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, and I asked to be first because everybody else has had some interesting experiences, but I thought I better tell you that I didn't want to go back to school, so I have always worn glasses, and I'm an asthmatic. So I told my family I was going to join the Waves, so they were delighted because they knew I couldn't pass the physical. So I did, and I had to have a waiver signed, and I wasn't quite 21. And also, how could I hide my age? Because I was born and raised here, and a lot of people were. I mean, we all I'm actually 4 years ahead of Paul Crowley, not 2. It was my brother. So anyway, there were 8 of us that had gone to South Pasadena, and we were all friends. So we had all joined the Waves, and we waited 2 months. But we were all becoming very close friends at that point. So we went down to the Union Station and got on the train. We stayed together, and we were determined to stay together, which we managed. We were sent to Hunter College in New York, to the Bronx. I'd heard about the Bronx all my life, and I mean, the Bronx was not what I had in mind. We had a charming, or a lovely, 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartment on the corner of Lexington and 196th Street. And it was just like being in a dormitory or a college. And we were issued uniforms, and everywhere we mustered and we marched and we went to the mess hall and managed to stay together. Then we were there 6 weeks learning all about the Navy and the terms and everything. And then, well, one of my close friends was Priscilla Hoffman. And she and I, we could sign up where we'd, fill in an application where we'd like to go. So Priscilla and I decided we'd spend the winter in Georgia. We had absolutely the same qualifications, not one thing different. So then we finally graduated from boot camp, and then we were given our orders. Priscilla was sent on a direct assignment to NSD Oakland, which was a naval supply. I didn't want to go back to school, so I went to Iowa State Teachers College in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And I was there for 2 months, and it was a secretarial school, which that was the farthest thing in my mind, but anyway, that was also delightful. We did have a gentleman by the name of Commander Petty, I believe, who was a commanding officer, sent to Iowa State Teachers College to be in charge of a lot of enlisted waves. Okay, he knew only Annapolis. That's the only place he'd been. So he ran Iowa State Teachers College like they ran things at Annapolis. So that was, we mustered and did all these things, and as anybody else that was in the service had to do. And the only exciting thing that happened to me, I was sort of a platoon leader or something, and I got to spend Christmas on the tree. And that means that you have to muster every 2 hours in full uniform and salute, and then go back for 2 hours. So I thought that was outstanding. That I could always tell everybody, that I spent Christmas on the tree, which I have. From Iowa State, when I finally graduated as a yeoman, which is a secretarial type position, I wanted to go to Boston, Washington, or New York. So I filled out all this because I'd been in California. And when I got my orders, I was sent to NSD Oakland, which is a naval supply, with Priscilla. So there we were, back together. Well, she was in some kind of a motor pool, and I should tell you that we finally figured out her uncle was Paul G. Hoffman, and he was head of Studebaker, and then she was related, and that's why she got the motor pool. So anyway, I knew that you never volunteered in the Navy, so I didn't want to be a secretary, so I volunteered. And I was sent to, in a unit with them, Commodore Durham, who had played, I think, quarterback. Anyway, played football in the Rose Bowl for Washington when they came out here. So he thought we were just great, or I was, because I knew about it. Excuse me. So we were there, and I did have to get clearance. I don't know why, but I will say that I was in some sort of a secret thing because we knew where all the ships were. I was actually back in ship stores or in doing things like that, or I knew bills of lading. So I got secret clearance. And my family weren't exactly thrilled because they went all over the neighborhood and asking people about me. And then people had friends and they really checked. But I don't know why, except I didn't know where all the ships, and anybody had an FPO number. I knew exactly where that ship was or where it was going, so that was interesting. And we lived in barracks in Oakland, downtown Oakland, and it was just like living in a dormitory. I mean, the waves did more for me than I ever did for the waves. And the only thing outstanding that I can say is the food was absolutely wonderful. We had a chef from the Palace Hotel, and we had breakfast for lunch and dinner, and then we'd eat on the base. I did stay there, and when the war was over, VJ Day, I was in sick bay. VJ Day. I had the flu and I was in sick bay, so I didn't get into all the excitement in San Francisco. But I did stay in until April. I served 27 months, and I was accumulating points. And when I got out, at least then I came home, but I received the same benefits as all the men on GI Bills. And it's just been a wonderful experience. I will say that it did more for me than I ever did for the United States Navy. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. That sounded like an exciting career. And
I wasn't even here when the Japanese bombs were at Santa Barbara.
oh, boy. Well, that's great. We have another wave, I think, on our program, but we'll see what she says. The next service lady we're going to hear from is Jean Bruce Poole. I left the name Bruce out in the program. I found out that wasn't the right thing to do either. And but it's Jean Bruce. She knows that the name is there now. Now Jean was a Wren in the British Navy, and she'll tell you how they got that. It's Women's Royal Naval Service, I think, more or less, from 1942 to 1945. She is right now is a historian. Jean has been very active on our old mill here in San Marino. She's been part of the California Historical Society and the Southern California Historical Society. She's presently works for the city of Los Angeles I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, but the director at El Pueblo de Delay. I'm not sure that I've got that right. But anyway, she might want to elaborate on that. But she is a historian. Jean is a real historian, and she comes from Great Britain. We have 2 Brits on the program out of our 5 ladies tonight. We'll see how they dovetail with each other. But I'd like to now to let, I don't have any idea what Jean did in the Royal Navy, but she'll tell us right now as soon as I hand her this mic.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's El Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument, and it's where Olvera Street, in case you're interested in coming to visit us. I joined the British Navy on July 18th, 1942, and now you're all going to know, but what can I do about it? 5 days after my 18th birthday. After initial training in London, I was assigned as a messenger and given a uniform of dark navy blue serge, double-breasted jacket and skirt, and a white shirt with a stiff collar and a black tie, black lace-up shoes and black stockings, and a kind of flattish sailor cap with a ribbon denoting the name of the ship or port to which we were attached, completed the outfit. As a messenger, I was given the boring tasks of delivering messages and traipsing up and down stairs in an 8-story building with no elevators, and standing sentry duty for hours on end, saluting officers and developing varicose veins. Fortunately, after a few months of this, I was rescued from these lowly activities and sent to Chatham, a naval port at the mouth of the Thames estuary, about an hour's train ride from London. We worked at the Combined Operations Headquarters of the Nore Command, which ran from the Scottish border south to Dover, a seaport low down on the east coast, and you may recall the White Cliffs of Dover. I was a naval plotter, which didn't mean getting involved in high-level conspiracies. Our job was to plot all the shipping that entered and left the Nore Command. We received reports from radar stations along the coast, and this was a fairly new innovation at the time, and they would tell us how big the blip was on their radar screens, and we would give whatever it was, a convoy or other types of shipping, a code name. Mostly, the shipping consisted of large groups of merchant ships protected by a couple of destroyers. These were nearly all the Lend-Lease destroyers that were given to Britain by the United States in 1941. They were named, when they came to England, after well-known fox hunts in England, and I'm sure that animal rights groups would disapprove of these names today. It wasn't safe for merchant ships to travel unescorted, as they would be prime targets for E-boat attack. E-boats were light, speedy German motor launches that would attack the convoys, especially at night. We worked in a huge tunnel about a quarter of a mile underground. The naval plot was an enormous map of the east coast of Britain and the coastal waters showing the swept channels. It was covered with perspex, or plastic, and we would have symbols indicating what the shipping was with code names in slots such as P5 or A6, which we pushed around like symbols on a Monopoly board. The plot was lower down than the quarters of the duty commander, who would come and lean over the railing to see the locations of all shipping passing through. One of my worst experiences was making a Wren friend, a very close friend, who was one of the duty officers, go off duty after her brother, who was a Mosquito pilot, had been shot down over the North Sea. Hours earlier, he'd been observed floating on a piece of the plane's wing, but the air-sea rescue forces couldn't find him. Night was falling, and the sea was getting rougher by the minute. When it rose to force 5, it was too rough for the lightweight boats to be out at sea, and the duty commander had to recall them. But first he told me to get her out of there. So I did. But on the way up in the tunnel, on the tunnel ramp, she said, "I know why you made me leave. It was because they were going to recall the air-sea rescue vessels." I said yes. She knew that he would die as a result, the only son in a family of 5 children. He was listed as missing, believed killed. Somehow it is so much worse when you know the person who is going to die. During my 2 years at Chatham, we lived in a Wrennery, a converted orphanage. We slept 5 or 6 to a room called a cabin, and our beds were called bunks, sometimes double. We were a mixed, double bunks. We were a mixed bag of people, but there were some illustrious names, which I thought you might want to hear about. One was Anne Spencer, whose father was Earl Spencer, daughter of Earl Spencer, and she became the aunt of the current Earl Spencer and Princess Diana. Another Wren was Elizabeth Scott, daughter of the Duke of Buccleuch, and my best friend was Iris Cole, is still, daughter of an admiral. We were all plotters together, but on different watches. We worked from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., and from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., and from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. When there was no enemy activity at night, we were allowed a couple of hours' sleep. After night duty, we had 24 hours off and usually went up to London and had some fun. I understand that in the American forces, fraternization between other ranks and officers was frowned upon, but certainly in the Wrens, that was not the case. I had several friends who were officers and went out with many of them. After about 2 years at Chatham, in March of 1944, there began to be an enormous build-up of shipping going around the coast to Portsmouth in the south of England, getting ready for the invasion. During that time, we had lots of extra security. All our mail was censored. We were warned not to talk about the build-up of shipping or anything relating to naval activities. We didn't know when the invasion would happen, but we knew it would be soon. In fact, D-Day was June the 6th, 1944. The following October, after the Americans and British had developed a foothold on the continent, the Navy decided to open a plot in Ostend, Belgium. They were only going to send 8 plotters and 1 officer to staff it. I was determined to be one of them and asked permission to go. My boss, Lieutenant Commander Keir, RNVR, that's the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, and they didn't have the straight girl bands, they had wavy bands on their sleeves. He didn't want to let me go because I was good at correcting charts. We received signals or messages with details about the swept channels, and only these channels were kept clear of mines to allow shipping to travel freely from one place to another. I liked correcting charts, But there was another person there who could do it, so I pushed hard. Finally, I threw a Latin quote at him, the only one I knew, and he gave in. The next step, as I was under 21, was to get my parents' permission to let me go abroad. I couldn't tell them where I was going, but they said yes anyway. On the appointed day, we left Sheerness, which is on the south coast, in an ML motor launch, and I'm sure I was wearing the duffel coat in the photo of me that's down there, which is only 53 years old. Well, there it is. And I'm sure I was wearing the duffel coat in the photo I brought tonight. I couldn't bear to part with the duffel coat. I never wear it, but it's nice to have. The sea was not exactly calm that day, but everything was okay as long as we stayed on deck. Apparently, when we were almost there, the captain got a signal to return to Britain as the sea was considered too rough for us to be out in it. But we made it safely to shore, and the adventure of being the only women in the forces in a town overrun with soldiers, sailors, and airmen began. That Christmas, I received 3 invitations for dinner. By the third one, I was excruciatingly uncomfortable, but we felt we couldn't play favorites. I remember several things about the 9 months we spent in Ostend. The first was seeing trainloads of people arrive in Ostend. They were returning prisoners from the concentration camps in Germany and Poland. One of the Belgian people I became friends with told me that they were very peculiar when they came back and didn't fit in well with their families. I'm sure they all need psychological treatment. One time I went home on leave on a landing ship used to transport tanks across the North Sea for the invasion. Before we embarked, they filled the hold with German prisoners of war. The army sergeants in charge were shouting at them to hurry up, herding them along. One of them told me they stink like polecats. Poor things, they probably hadn't had a bath for weeks. It wasn't their fault. Also, when I went to the hairdresser in Ostend to get my hair cut, they told me I shouldn't cut my hair short like it is now because it made me look like the collaborators who had had their heads shaved. I did anyway because I like it short, as I thought my uniform would protect me, which of course it did. After VE Day in May 1945, the Navy was in a hurry to take care of the minefields in the waters outside Ostend. So I was sent to work for Captain MS. The Navy had captured the German charts showing where they had laid the mines, and Captain MS's ship was the headquarters of the minesweeper, that's what MS stands for, flotilla, and was anchored in the naval dockyard. I was the only woman in the dockyard, and all the sailors were very sweet to me, taking my photograph and being friendly. One day, as I was working on my charts, I heard a loud noise, like something heavy slipping on the deck above. Then there was an enormous crash, followed by a volley of oaths, such as I had never heard previously, nor since. I looked up, ready to share the excitement, but the 2 officers in the wardroom with me were studiously bent over their work and said nothing. The following Saturday, I went to work as usual, and when the petty officer brought me my tea, he stopped to chat because the officers were out on the beach. He asked the sailor messenger who was sitting there how he was enjoying his CB. This means confined to barracks. I said to the sailor, "What did you get CB for?" He said, "For swearing." I said, "Oh my goodness, was that you?" Apparently, they'd all been told that a woman was coming aboard and no one was to swear. But when he was swabbing down the decks and accidentally slipped on a cake of soap, he couldn't restrain himself. His punishment also included, in addition to 2 weeks of CB, he got 3 days stoppage of rum. In those days, the British Navy gave every sailor an ounce of rum, and he was not allowed rum for 3 days. I told him how sorry I was, and he said that it was all right as his girlfriend had given him a drink through the railings of the dockyard. When I was in Ostend, a friend took me to meet the famous artist James Ensor, who lived there. He was quite old then and died 2 or 3 years later in 1947. But interestingly, there is an enormous and rather strange painting by him at the new Getty Museum, which reminded me of our meeting. It's called Christ's Entry into Brussels in 1889. And if you've been to the art galleries there, you could hardly miss it. Another time I got a weekend leave in Paris. It was such a wonderful place that I was determined to go back there, and after demobilization in November of 1945, I made plans to go to the Sorbonne there, which is what I did next. My 3+ years in the Wrens was mostly a very good experience, and in those patriotic days, I really felt I was contributing to the war effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. Having listened to these two ladies talk about their involvement in the secrets of where the ships and planes were going and checking all of that stuff, it sounds a little elementary today because our Pentagon has everything like that on computer, on a net. They call it a Netscape. The location of every mine, every plane, every sub, every soldier in the United States military is identified and plotted and logged. And they found out 2 months ago, you may have seen on TV, that a 16-year-old kid in London had access to every military secret in the United States. He had penetrated our code, was getting printouts of where all our ships were going, and the general at the Pentagon, when asked what he was going to do about it, he said, I guess we need to hire some 16-year-old kids in here. So things haven't changed much. I think now our next speaker, I don't know that we need to have two British speakers in a row. We need to switch accents for a minute. So at this point, I'm going to call on Eileen Ferguson, who is a U.S. Army pilot, a WASP. Does anybody remember what they were, the WASPs? Got one hand in the room. I'm going to do something a little different. She's asked me to. I'm going to read very briefly a description of what the WASPs are, and I think this will go quickly and it will be pretty clear and let us all know what our U.S. Air Force WASPs were. First of all, for the kids in this room, there are a few in the back, I should mention that we had two wars going on. We had the war in Europe, in which Germany had invaded Poland and France in 1939 and 40, and England came into the war, and England was left all alone over in Europe trying to hold on while the Germans overran Europe. And then later, in 1941, December 7th, we were attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, and we got into a war in the Pacific, which the British also joined in. So there were the whole world was involved in wars, one on one side, and the European War, and then the war in the Pacific. But they were simultaneous after 1941. In December 41, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, a group of American women volunteered to go to England and ferry planes there. At their head was Jacqueline Cochran, the most famous woman pilot of the 20th century. Mrs. Cochran had already proposed to General Hap Arnold a program employing women pilots in the United States to free male flyers for overseas duties should the need arise. In midsummer 1942, General Arnold, hard-pressed for pilots, told Mrs. Cochran to come home from England and put her plan into action, which she did. Few American women had enough piloting time to meet the requirements for joining the Air Transport Command, which ferried the planes. However, by December 25 had qualified as members of the WAFS, Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, under Mrs. Nancy Love. Meanwhile, in Houston, a cadet flight school had enrolled 28 women, each having a minimum of 200 pilot hours, and they were undergoing vigorous training from which two were withdrawn for medical reasons. 3 failed to pass the tough test, and an additional student reported late. Facilities proved inadequate, and the school was transferred to Avenger Field, Sweetwater, Texas. As the urgent needs of the Air Forces increased, so did the duties to which women graduates were assigned. By September 43, they were purporting not only to ferry aircraft, but to tow target training. That's towing targets around for target shooting. For 4-Ranger Bomber School and to B-25 and B-26 schools from which they were assigned to other bases. The acronym WAFS, W-A-F-S, referred to ferrying squadrons and was no longer applicable. So with the appointments of Cochrane to direct all WASPs, the name was from then on Women Air Force Service Pilots. Mrs. Love simultaneously was designated executive for the WASPs. Aviation had never witnessed, nor is ever likely to witness again, anything like what these young women pilots tackled and accomplished. The word experimental was forgotten. Under top secret conditions, a group trained to fly tow target pilots. Of that group, some then learned to fly radio-controlled target planes. During that training, one WASP sat in a tiny PQ-8 craft controlled by a second WASP in a mothership using radio controls. The captive WASP rode helpless as her tiny plane zoomed and dived, but in dire emergency, she was ready to override the radio controls. These towing targets were used over and over. More than one WASP-piloted plane landed with holes in it as they shot at each other. Some of these low-level missions, laying down smoke screens in mock chemical warfare, were used. Others flew fighter aircraft as targets for fighter pilots who shot film. In the ferrying division, they transported airplanes all over the country and over to Europe. They practiced flying by reference solely with instrumentation and crisscrossed the nation making deliveries in more and more complicated planes. By the time when all WASPs left service, the women were ferrying every P-47 Republic Thunderbolt rolling off factory lines, and just about the same for all other fighter aircraft. The WASPs flew all over the United States. They were a huge contributor to what we had to do during the war, these lady pilots. Unlike other women in military service, the WASPs never received the militarization promised to them. 38 died in the line of duty. They died and were buried without military honors. Perhaps our speaker can address that. I have no idea why. No WASP enjoyed the privileges of other veterans after the war ended, but in every way, save one, WASPs lived a military life. The exception was their right to resign, a right few exercised until they were told they would be sent home on December 20th, 1944. Even then, well over 900 continued in service to the last moment of the final hour. In the mid-1970s, newspapers announced that the Air Force planned to train its first women military pilots. To the WASPs, this news was an outrage. They once began a campaign to be recognized as the veterans they knew themselves to be. In 1977, Congress acknowledged these facts. These women were indeed veterans, pilots who had done dangerous duty when their nation needed them. But official acceptance did not come until 1979. The Women's Air Force Service Pilots, WASPs, are proud that in 1984 each was awarded the Victory Medal, and those who served on duty for more than a year also received the American Theater Medal. Eileen Ferguson was one of these WASPs. She was born in Baltimore, worked a few years after high school, and then took flying lessons in 1943, joined the WASPs in February of 1944, and it was in the WASPs until they were disbanded. She came out here to UCLA and got her degree and has been a teacher for 30 years in the Alhambra School District. And she lives now in Pasadena. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic to Eileen Ferguson.
Yes. I'm really not an illiterate. I just have terrible eyesight anymore, and reading is very difficult. So thank you so much for doing that for me. That's the best official summary and the quickest one I could give. So from here, I'll tell about the things that I did, how I got started, and what really called me to go into the service. I'd worked, as I said, in Baltimore for a little while, and I was doing clerical work and could not get free from that job because we were locked into or frozen into our jobs because it was called a critical one. But I did some things on the side. I used to man one weekend a month. I would go down into the lower, about the 3 floors below the ground at the City Hall and man the phone banks there for emergency incoming calls. I drove an ambulance for the just to take refreshments actually down to the fellows who were on some of the bases with other women. We had to even learn to change truck tires. That was not fun. Then when my friend learned about the WASP program, we went out to Westminster, Maryland. We had to drive about 30 miles inland from the coast because no flying was permitted between that area and the coastline itself for security reasons. It took us almost a year to get the flight time in, and if I had known about it, I probably would have gone to a college preparatory program and taken a flight course there. But smart me, I was not at that time. Anyway, my friend Lila Mann and I did enter from after our 35 hours, which was the minimum required to apply to the WASP. We went to Washington, had our tests, and were sent to Sweetwater, Texas. Drove out there and stayed until the program disbanded in December. There were we lived in regular barracks. We had men's mechanic overalls to wear for every day, the old khaki things. We rolled up the sleeves and rolled up the pants. I even have a picture of two women in one in one leg and one in the other, and there they were. They were big. We had to wear white turbans because no hair could touch the collars. Even the women who had short hair, we had to wear these white turbans and tie them around here so that our hair was not down away, so we looked more like in uniform. We walked in formations to our classes and to meals and everything else. We got up about 6 o'clock in the morning and went to breakfast, and then either we're on the flight line for the first part of the morning or in ground school, and then to be reversed with the other flight. We were divided, each class was divided into 2 flights, and there were 7 classes on the field at one time in various rates of progression. Some are almost ready to graduate and so on. We graduated about every 4 to 6 weeks. And we made up songs for their graduation, composed these little ditties and things and sang them, and we still do. And some were fun, and some were nice, and some were not nice, you know, that kind of thing. But we had a good time. Our pilots were, with whom we were trained, were civilian pilots. And then we were tested by Army test pilots for the check rides. We flew in 3 kinds of airplanes at Avenger Field in Texas. We flew the PT-17, which is a biplane tandem, two people, tandem cockpit, open cockpit. And we wore the leather helmets and the leather. In the wintertime, we had these sheepskin clothes. They were really fantastic. The leather was outside with the brown dye on that, and the fleece was to our bodies to keep us warm because they were cold planes. And we started in February, so it was really cold. When it rained, it was muddy up to Yahoo, and we went out to, we had cement runways at the main field where we flew from, but there were also auxiliary fields, and we flew out, were taken in buses. Sometimes there were old school buses with or without windows, sometimes in cattle trucks. I kid you not. And we stood up and held on till we got out there and had very rudimentary facilities out there, but we always showed up with three or four dozen donuts to help us through the morning hours or the afternoon hours. One flight would fly in the morning, the other flight would fly in the afternoon to reverse things. Our check rides were at the end of the primary period and also at the end of the intermediate period, which was flown in a BT-13, a low-wing, also open cockpit tandem plane that ran about, I guess it was 235 horsepower. And then our advanced trainer was the AT-6, which is a North American plane, the same as the SNJ-3 that flew off the Navy carriers. Had retractable landing gear and a sliding plastic hatch. Really could put out some good speed. It was a nice, beautiful plane to fly. We had to learn what they called unusual maneuvers, which were acrobatics, so that we could recover from whatever position we might have to find ourselves in. We also did cross country, went from Sweetwater to Phoenix, to Phoenix on one of our trips. We also did night flying, and we learned to do instrument flying under the hood so you don't see anything but your instruments, and you must get where you're going to go, which meant listening to radio signals, on one side of the radio beam and dot it on the other. So you tried to find a middle point and stay on it until you came over to over the station. We usually use Abilene, and there's a cone of silence there. And if you hit that, you're right on the money. It means you really have arrived where you're supposed to be. And then sometimes you have to take a flight out around and come back in and lower down to another level, and another time out and back to let other planes theoretically under you land and get out of the way. So we had some very refined training. We did acrobatic training so that we could recover from strange things we might find ourselves in. I had 2 experiences that were pretty strange. One of them, I've forgotten what the other one was. That's a long time memory. Well, one of it was an accident. I was doing spins with an instructor, thank goodness, in the AT-6, and that was a necessary thing. We had to learn to do those things. And I was wearing an A2 jacket, and of course it has this knit cuff on it, and we were doing a right spin. To recover from that, you cross your stick over to the left real hard. You're going like this down the whole business, doing this business. And raveling, believe it or not, on the cuff, caught the notch that opened the seat belt. I hit the ceiling, broke out the plastic. Thank goodness there was a little metal frame there, and I fell back down onto the stick, which meant we were still going straight down. So I had to walk my way up and holding the top and my feet on the floorboards so that the instructor behind me could recover from it. So that's why I'm here. Otherwise, splat. That would not have been a nice thing. Oh, well, the other thing I was going to tell you about was, the only thing that happened was I got a little cut here. It's like to scare my instructor to death when I turned around and said, "I'm all right." He said, "Yes, really." Anyway, the other thing that happened was one evening, we were in bed and lights were out and had been for about an hour, and it was just raining cats and dogs. And we heard a plane over the field, round and round and round. And this was not a night field at that time. They had lights they could put on, but every night they closed it down dark and just had a red light up above the tower. And we thought, there's a plane up there, and the lights are not on the field. He didn't know where in the world he is. So we put together a little plot. We'll get up, drive our cars out at the end of the runway, turn the headlights shining down the runway. So we did. And there was a plane had come from Roscoe, which is north of us there, from the airfield there, and they really were lost. So these fellows came in and landed on our airstrip and came on in, stayed the night. They found barracks for them to set up in. So that was kind of an unusual thing for us to happen. We felt good about that one. Now, after graduation, I was sent to Columbus, Mississippi for the test and engineering section, and there were twin-engine planes there. We learned, transitioned into those. Not the fancy ones, just the two-engine trainers. And they didn't have enough for us to do. There were men sitting all over the place, having been in theaters of war, and they knew good and well that they didn't need us there very much. So some of the bases were very, very busy, but we were not. So I was sent back to, along with 4 or 5 of the other women who were there, for advanced instrument and another session of about 6 weeks at Sweetwater. And then it wasn't too long after that until we were ready to be sent home. On our cross-country trip, we went to Phoenix, and I remember it was so hot there. We had to put on our gloves to open the hatch cover, and our feet were in the asphalt like this. You know, it was really, really sticky and bad. I had a wonderful, wonderful experience, and I'm so grateful to Miss Cochran. She really was married, you know, later on. She married Mr. Floyd Odlum, who was a stockbroker in New York, and they had a beautiful home out at Indio. And she made it possible for all of us to have the experiences we did have. She was a leader. She didn't know who her parents were at all. She really came up from absolutely nothing, a poor southern country girl who had been raised in a foster home, became a beautician to earn her living at all, went to Florida, met this man, and with some social contacts she had there, and she just really made a success of her life. She had all the records that were possible for a woman to have. She not only did the Powder Puff Derby and all the other races and things, but she also was the first woman to break the sound barrier. Through her, we met Chuck Yeager. She brought him to one of the conferences that we had out at Indio, and he spoke to us at one of our luncheons there. She was his friend, and he saw that she knew how to do this, because this was a solo flight that she had to do. I think she was an outstanding person. She really pulled herself up by her bootstraps, and she made possible for me to have this wonderful, wonderful experience. As WASP, we still gather together. After 30 years, we found we weren't veterans when these young women from the Air Force Academy were recognized. We said, oh, we better find out about this. So we began to get in touch with one another, because we knew maybe 2 or 3 others we'd kept up with over these 25 years. So we have a roster. We have national meetings every 2 years. We meet in various cities and have 300, 400 people show up, plus their children and grandchildren, relatives, shirt-tail people. And we have local meetings. There are a lot of people in Southern California who are in the WASP program, from Bakersfield out to Palm Springs, Indio, and down to San Diego. There must be 100 of us out here now. And we have a meeting, it may be 60 or 70 will show up 4 times a year. So that's at our big meeting in Indio. We go out there for December meeting. But the other times, when we go out to restaurants or something like that, there are 25, 30, 35, 40 people there. We have a good camaraderie. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eileen. I think at this point we'll switch back to a Brit again. We like to do that. Marie Williams is a local resident here in San Marino, and her husband M was in the British Army all over the world in World War II, but M's not going to say anything tonight. We're going to have his wife Marie do the talking. And Marie is, as I say, a Wren, but she was in Liverpool during the Blitz, the air blitz the Germans perpetrated over England. And she was a paymaster in London and in Scotland. We have the map up here. That's another reason I decided to put you on right now, Marie, because we still have the map of England up there. And she did a lot of stuff overseas. She, among other, and she'll tell you this, but she was on the aircraft carrier Implacable, which was the flagship of the British fleet on the other side of the world. And she was one of 12 female Wrens on an aircraft carrier with 4,000 men. And she may want to elaborate on that, I don't know. But at any rate, I think we'll just hear right now from Marie Williams.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Earlier this evening, Paul said that we only could speak for 10 minutes. Now, my war experience took 6 years. So that works out at 1 minute and 40 seconds for each of those years. So please, all of you, remember that if you sneeze or cough, you're going to miss a couple of years. After our war was declared on September the 3rd, 1939, uniformed men and women were everywhere, as the reserves were called to the colors. Life in Liverpool changed completely overnight. Blackout was put into effect immediately, schools closed, and churches no longer held evening services. Ration cards were issued, and the ARP asked all the homeowners to take down their lace curtains and glue them right onto the windows. Buckets of sand were, with a shovel, were put in every house. And of course, we were issued with gas masks. Now, these gas masks came in little tiny cardboard boxes, and pretty soon all the ladies were busily making smart little containers for them. We had to carry them everywhere we went. Fortunately, we didn't ever get to use them in a gas attack. But we did find a real good use for them. And they proved to be very effective when we were cutting or chopping onions. Children from the inner city and the dock areas of Liverpool were evacuated. Many of them went to the beautiful villages in North Wales. And some of them were evacuated to Canada, and some came to the US. A few of them came to the US. Air raid shelters were built all over the city. Ack-ack guns, searchlights, and barrage balloons were located right in our local parks. I remember the first Sunday after war was declared that we watched a small plane flying over Liverpool. We were there with all our neighbors just watching it, and suddenly the ack-ack opened up. We couldn't believe it. Just a few minutes later, we had our first casualty of the war as the plane was shot down. I remember feeling very sad for the airman. I mean, he was probably out on his last joyride before he was joined to the colors. I was just 2 months from my 14th birthday at that time. Liverpool, next to London, is the largest seaport in Liverpool, in England. And we have miles and miles of docks. It was always a very busy port, but once and it became busier once the ships started to arrive in convoy. This period of the war was called the phony war by a lot of people, but I'm sure that the naval ships and the